In the last days of January of 1937, the Green River drainage of south-central Kentucky carried more water than anyone living there had ever measured. Rain fell for nearly 3 weeks with almost no real pause, and the backwater from the flooding Ohio River pushed up every tributary that fed it, the Nolin River among them. Fields that had been dry pasture in December sat under 15 feet of brown water by the end of January. Barns floated off their foundations, and livestock had to be moved to high ground on borrowed trucks. In the town of Cave City, families moved their furniture to the second floor and waited out the water. By the 3rd of February, when the water along the Nolin finally began to drop, a farmer working a ridge above the river noticed that a slab of limestone the size of a delivery truck had sheared clean off the face of a bluff near his property line and dropped into the shallows below. Behind where the slab had been, the flood had opened a black gap in the rock, maybe 4 feet high, running back into the hillside farther than his lantern could show him. He did not go in. He rode into Mammoth Cave and told a park ranger, and the ranger, who had spent enough of his life underground to know when a hole in a Kentucky hillside was worth a second look, wrote a short account of it and mailed it to the Kentucky Geological Survey in Lexington. What the survey found when a field man finally reached the site 3 weeks later was not a natural fissure. It was a corridor, cut and shaped by hand, braced along both walls with hewn oak timber joined at the corners, running back into the bluff on a level floor for a distance nobody managed to measure that year, because the man sent to measure it ran out of daylight, and the war that came 4 years later meant nobody was sent again. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand why a flood-cut passage in a Kentucky bluff still raises questions 90 years later, it helps to understand what kind of ground the Nolin River cuts through. This is Karst country, the same limestone belt that produces Mammoth Cave itself a few miles east, and the belt does not stop at the park boundary. It runs under farms and pasture and river bluff for miles in every direction, riddled with sinkholes, blind valleys, and passages that have never been mapped because nobody has ever had a reason to look for them. People had lived and worked this ground for a very long time before the flood of 1937, and some of them had gone into the caves on purpose. Inside Mammoth Cave and its neighbor Salt's Cave, explorers in the 19th century found cane torch fragments, worn moccasins, gourd containers, and scraped mineral walls left by people mining gypsum, mirabolite, and Epsom salts from the cave's dry passages. In 1935, 2 years before the Nolin flood, cavers inside Mammoth Cave found the body of a man crushed under a 6-ton boulder that had fallen on him while he worked a narrow gypsum vein. The cave's dry air had preserved him well enough that his sandals and his digging tools were still recognizable. He came to be called Lost John, and decades later, when researchers were finally able to date the cane torches and woven material recovered from these passages, the work showed that people had been mining inside this stretch of Kentucky limestone for well over 1,000 years, in some galleries for closer to 2,000, moving through crawlways on their hands and knees with nothing but burning cane to light the way and nothing but their own weight to hold the ceiling up. The dating work that eventually confirmed how long that mining had gone on came later than the flood, and it came from a different direction than anyone in 1937 could have expected. In the 1970s, an archaeologist named Patty Jo Watson led a research team that ran radiocarbon dates on cane torch fragments, paleofeces, and woven sandal material recovered from Mammoth Cave and Salt's Cave over the previous century. The results placed the earliest confirmed mining activity in the system at roughly 2,000 years before the present, with use continuing off and on for well over a millennium after that. Watson's team also traced what the minerals themselves were for. Gypsum and mirabolite were not mined for their own sake so much as for what they could become: pigment, temper mixed into pottery clay, and, in the case of mirabolite and epsomite, a mild purgative salt that appears to have moved beyond the cave system entirely, showing up in trace amounts at sites hundreds of miles away that belong to the broader woodland period exchange network archaeologists call the Hopewell interaction sphere. A mineral pulled out of a dark Kentucky crawlway by torchlight could, by that account, end up changing hands several times before it reached a village on the Ohio River or further north still. None of Watson's survey teams ever reached the Nolin Bluff. By the time her radiocarbon work was underway, the corridor Sizemore had walked was already 40 years gone under standing water, and nothing in the published record of her project suggests anyone connected to it knew the site had existed at all. That is the baseline. That is what the region's dry caves were known to hold before 1937. Unbraced passages, low enough in most places that a grown man had to crawl, worked by people who left behind woven sandals and torch char and mussel shell scrapers, but never, in any gallery archaeologists had catalogued by that point, a single cut and fitted timber. The corridor exposed by the flood on the Nolin Bluff did not match that pattern. It stood high enough for a man to walk upright. Its walls were braced every few feet with oak posts mortised into crossbeams overhead, a construction method that takes iron tools, seasoned lumber, and a working knowledge of how much weight a timber set can carry before it fails. Nothing about the technique resembled the crawlways at Mammoth Cave. Nothing about it, on first glance, resembled prehistoric work at all. And yet the corridor sat inside a bluff that had never been logged, never been mined on any deed the county held, and never appeared on a single geological survey map made of that stretch of the Nolin before the flood tore its front wall away. The mechanics of what the flood actually did to that bluff are worth setting out plainly, because they explain why a passage that had presumably sat sealed for centuries chose that particular week to reopen. Limestone bluffs along the Green and Nolin rivers erode from the inside as much as from the outside through a slow process geologists call epikarst weathering, in which slightly acidic groundwater dissolves the rock along old fracture lines for centuries before anything visible happens at the surface. A bluff face can look solid for 100 years, while the rock behind it turns to rubble along a joint the water found first. What the flood of 1937 did was apply, in the space of about 10 days, more hydraulic pressure against that weakened joint than the bluff had felt in generations, undercutting its base with fast water, and then, as the river dropped just as quickly, releasing that pressure all at once. The slab that sheared away was not blasted or dug out. It failed the way an overloaded beam fails, along the exact seam the water had already spent decades preparing. That is also why nobody had found the corridor before. The joint that finally gave way had likely been sealed by collapsed rubble and sediment for a very long time, possibly since whoever built the timber bracing walked out of it for the last time. The relief program that put Everett Sizemore on the Kentucky Geological Survey's payroll was one of several operating in the state that year under the federal government's broader effort to employ men left jobless by the Depression, work that ranged from road grading and school construction to exactly the kind of field work the survey needed and could not otherwise afford. Sizemore was 26 years old in the spring of 1937, trained in basic surveying but with no formal background in archaeology, which was itself unremarkable for the period. State geological surveys across the country routinely used relief-funded fieldmen to document caves, mineral deposits, and unusual geological features, flagging anything that looked like it belonged to archaeology or ethnology for a specialist to examine later. The system worked reasonably well when a specialist was actually available to send. In 1937, with the whole of the Ohio Valley recovering from the worst flood damage the region had ever recorded, specialists were in short supply everywhere at once, and a single relief program surveyor with a lantern and a notebook was often the only person who would ever lay eyes on a discovery like the one waiting inside the Nolin Bluff. The field man the Kentucky Geological Survey sent out that March was a young topographer named Everett Sizemore, on loan to the survey through one of the federal relief programs that were putting men to work across the state that year. Sizemore's job was straightforward on paper: walk the corridor, sketch its dimensions, note anything worth a follow-up visit, and file a report. What he found once he was inside took him most of a day to record. The corridor ran back from the breach at a shallow downward grade, its bracing consistent for the first 100 feet or so, and then abruptly different, the oak posts giving way to a rougher style of support, built from whatever timber had been on hand rather than milled lumber, as though two different crews working generations apart had each finished a section and stopped. Along the floor near the transition point, Sizemore found scattered fragments of worked chert, several pieces of charred cane consistent with the torch fragments already known from Mammoth Cave, and, close against the wall, a scatter of what he described in his notes as small white crystalline nodules, the kind of mineral deposit that had drawn miners into this limestone for 2,000 years before anyone in Kentucky owned a saw. What he did not find was any trace of who had cut and set the oak timber, or when. Sizemore's measurements, where he managed to take them, add a layer of specificity that the surviving summary correspondence does not. He recorded the corridor's braced section as running roughly 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, with paired oak posts set at intervals of about 3 feet, each post cut to a length of just under 7 feet, and squared on at least 2 faces with what he judged to be a broadaxe rather than a saw. The cross beams overhead were shorter, notched to seat into the posts rather than simply laid across them, a joinery choice that keeps a roof beam from sliding sideways under an uneven rock load, the same basic principle 19th century mine engineers used in far larger operations across Kentucky's coal country. The small white nodules he collected near the transition point were sent along with his report to the Kentucky Geological Survey's mineral laboratory, where a technician logged them as consistent with mirabilite, the same hydrated sodium sulfate mineral already well documented from Mammoth Cave's own galleries a few miles away, confirming at least that the corridor tapped the same regional mineral resource that had drawn miners into this limestone for 2,000 years. The laboratory notation is one of the only pieces of Sizemore's original submission that survives in the Kentucky Geological Survey's modern archive, a single card in a mineral catalogue with no cross-reference back to the corridor it came from, because whoever filed the mineral sample and whoever filed the topographic sketch were, by 1938, no longer working from the same set of instructions. Sizemore's report went to the Kentucky Geological Survey office in Lexington, where it was logged, filed, and, according to the survey's own later correspondence, forwarded as a courtesy to the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of American Ethnology in Washington, on the reasoning that a mixed prehistoric and historic mining feature fell outside the survey's own mandate and squarely inside the Bureau's. Nobody at the Bureau replied that year. 1937 was not a season in which a Bureau field office in Washington had spare staff to send chasing a flood-cut hole in a Kentucky hillside, not with dust storms displacing families across the Great Plains and federal relief money already stretched thin, trying to hold the country together. The report sat. 2 years later, it sat some more. By 1941, the relief program that had employed Sizemore had folded most of its Kentucky field crews into other work, and by December of that year, the country had larger things to attend to than an unfinished topographic sketch of a bluff on the Nolin River. Sizemore himself left the survey's employ sometime in 1942, and no one who worked with him afterward remembered him mentioning the corridor again. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What happened to the report is, in its own way, an ordinary story about how institutions lose things. Paper gets filed under the wrong heading, a field man moves to another job, a bureau in another city has other fires to put out. None of that requires anyone to have hidden anything on purpose. But an ordinary bureaucratic failure and a genuine act of neglect can produce the exact same outcome, and in this case they did, because the ground above the corridor changed hands twice more before anyone with an archaeological reason to care ever went looking for Sizemore's notes again. The first sale was unremarkable, a farm passing from one family to another the way farms do. The second sale, in 1958, was to the federal government, because by then the Army Corps of Engineers had settled on the Nolin River Valley as the site for a flood control dam, the same kind of project that the flood of 1937, among others, had made politically possible across the entire Ohio Valley. Construction on Nolin River Dam began in 1959, and finished in 1963. When the gates closed and the reservoir behind them began to fill, more than 5,000 acres of the river valley went underwater, including the stretch of Bluff where a farmer had once watched a slab of limestone shear away and drop into the shallows. Nobody went back into the corridor before the water rose. There is no record that anyone from the Corps of Engineers, the state, or any university was aware the passage still existed by the time the reservoir project was approved, because Sizemore's report, and the survey correspondence referencing it, had been reclassified at some point in the intervening years under a general flood damage file rather than an archaeological one, which meant it did not surface when the Corps ran its standard cultural resource review before construction. The review found what the available records showed it: farmland, a family cemetery slated for relocation, the ordinary trace of 19th and 20th century settlement. It did not find a braced corridor cut into limestone because the one document that would have told the reviewers to look for it was sitting in the wrong drawer in Lexington. The oak-timbered passage that a Kentucky Geological Survey fieldman had once walked with a lantern went under 60 feet of reservoir water without a single additional word being written about it, and the file that could have prevented that stayed exactly where a clerk had put it in 1938. The relocation work that came with the Nolin project followed a pattern used across dozens of Army Corps reservoir projects throughout the 1950s and 60s. Families in the flood pool were bought out, cemeteries were disinterred and moved to new ground above the projected waterline, and roads were rerouted around what would become open water. The Corps kept careful records of every grave moved and every structure demolished, because families and county officials both had reason to insist on it. No equivalent record exists for the corridor, not because the Corps handled the two kinds of site differently on purpose, but because only one of them had ever been formally identified as something worth tracking. A cemetery is self-evidently a cemetery. A hole in a bluff that a farmer reported once 20 years earlier to a survey office that no longer had the original file readily at hand was not self-evidently anything, and the review process that protected the graves had no comparable trigger built in to protect a passage nobody currently working the project had any reason to know was there. What survives of Sizemore's visit is not the official report, which the survey's own archive can no longer produce in full, but a personal field notebook that stayed in his family after he died in 1974. His granddaughter donated a box of his papers to a regional historical society in the early 2000s, and inside that box, alongside topographic sketches from a dozen unrelated jobs, sat 16 pages describing the Nolin corridor in far more detail than the surviving fragments of his official report ever did. The notebook is not a polished document. It is written in pencil, in the shorthand of a man recording things for his own later reference rather than for a supervisor's file, and a regional historian who examined it in 2011 has treated it as a plausible first-hand account rather than a verified scientific record, since it was never cross-checked against a second observer at the time. Read that way, with that caution attached, it is still the fullest surviving description of what the flood exposed. Sizemore wrote that the corridor's air stayed a steady, even temperature the entire 140 feet he was able to walk before his lantern oil ran low, cooler than the February air outside, and dry enough that his boots raised dust rather than mud, the same dry stability that had preserved Lost John's sandals a few miles away. He wrote that the oak bracing in the first section showed axe marks consistent with a hand tool rather than a mill blade, and that at least one of the corner joints had been pegged rather than nailed, a detail he underlined twice, apparently because it told him the work predated common iron nails in that part of Kentucky. He wrote that past the transition point, where the bracing style changed, the passage narrowed and the ceiling dropped low enough that he had to duck, and that the floor there was littered with cane fragments and worked stone in a pattern that matched, closely enough that he noted the comparison himself, what he had read about the crawlway galleries at Mammoth Cave. He wrote that he found no bones, no ceramic vessels, and no metal beyond the timber joints themselves, and that he turned back not because the passage ended, but because his light was failing, and he did not want to find out what happened to a man alone in a hole in the ground with no lantern. His last line on the subject, added at the bottom of the final page in different, darker pencil, as though he had come back to it later, reads simply that he intended to request a return trip with a full survey crew and better lighting, and that he never did. The regional historian who catalogued the donation in 2011 added a brief note of her own to the folder, stating that she had cross-checked what she could against county deed records and the surviving fragments of the Kentucky Geological Survey correspondence, and that nothing in either source contradicted Sizemore's account, though neither source could independently confirm the details he recorded once he was past the point his official report described. That is the honest position the notebook occupies today. Unverified where verification would require going back into a corridor nobody has been able to reach in over 60 years, but consistent everywhere it can be checked against an outside record, with what little outside record survives. What Sizemore's notes describe, if the notebook is read as an honest record of what one tired fieldman saw by lantern light in 1937, is a single passage carrying two different histories inside it. The far section, low, cane-littered, unbraced, fits the same technique documented across Mammoth Cave and Salt's Cave, the same technique the dating work on those torch fragments would later place across roughly 2,000 years of use, ending sometime before European settlement reached this part of Kentucky. The near section, upright, timbered, pegged rather than nailed, fits no known local mining record at all. It predates the machine-cut lumber and wire nails common by the later 19th century, based on the joinery alone, but it also postdates, by any reasonable reading of the tool marks Sizemore recorded, the prehistoric mining technique visible in the passage behind it. Somewhere in the centuries between those two eras, someone reopened and reinforced an already old mining passage on the Nolin River Bluff, using skills and tools that belonged to neither the prehistoric miners who first cut it, nor the 20th century surveyors who found it again. No documented Kentucky mining operation, saltpeter, gypsum or otherwise, has a recorded claim on this stretch of the Nolin. The county's own mineral deed records for the area, which do exist going back to the 1820s, show nothing filed on that particular bluff. Whoever braced that corridor did the work without leaving a legal trace of having done it, on ground where a legal trace was, by that period, the normal way business was done. There is a broader pattern worth setting beside this one, because south-central Kentucky's cave country was never mined only once. Mammoth Cave itself carries at least two distinct layers of extraction history stacked on top of each other: the prehistoric gypsum and mirabilite mining that produced Lost John and the torchlit crawlways, and, roughly 2,000 years later, a very different and very well-documented operation during the War of 1812, when enslaved laborers were forced to work the cave's entrance passages extracting calcium nitrate for gunpowder using wooden vats, hollowed log pipes, and leaching systems that survive in the cave to this day and that visitors can still see on the standard tour route. That operation used timber, it used skilled construction, and it stopped abruptly when the war ended and the price of imported saltpeter collapsed, leaving equipment in place that nobody bothered to remove. If a similar operation, smaller and unrecorded, reached the Nolin Bluff during that same window, working an older prehistoric shaft, the way the Mammoth Cave saltpeter crews worked older prehistoric galleries, it would explain the pegged joints, the hand axe marks, and the total absence of a deed. It would not explain why nobody, not the property's later owners, not the county mineral office, not a single family history collected by the Regional Historical Society, ever mentioned it. An operation large enough to brace 140 feet of corridor with mortised oak timber was not a project one or two men finished in secret over a weekend. It required a crew, tools, and enough time on the site that somebody nearby should have known. Nobody did, or if they did, nobody who left a written record. That absence is, on its own terms, part of what the corridor still argues. The bluff sat on private farmland for well over a century after any plausible date for the timber work, changed hands at least twice on record, and never once produced a family story about a mine, a dig, or a hidden passage, not even the kind of exaggerated local legend that tends to attach itself to any hole in the ground a farmer's children have been warned to stay out of. Either the operation that braced this corridor finished its work quickly enough and left without drawing local notice that the memory of it did not survive a single generation of the families who farmed above it, or the memory did survive in a form nobody thought worth writing down until a flood forced the question back into the open in 1937, and even then, the one report that tried to chase the answer sat in a filing cabinet until the reservoir made the question impossible to answer at all. Today, the Bluff Everett Sizemore, climbed in the spring of 1937, sits under the surface of Nolin River Lake, roughly 60 feet down at normal pool, somewhere along the flooded river channel between the dam and the old community of Wax, which was itself relocated before the reservoir filled. The Army Corps of Engineers, which manages the lake, occasionally lowers the pool for maintenance or during drought years, and in those low water seasons, old roadbeds, building foundations, and cemetery markers from the flooded valley have surfaced along the exposed banks, photographed by local residents and occasionally covered by regional news. The corridor itself has never been among them. During a significant drought in the early 2000s, the lake dropped low enough to expose long stretches of the original river channel and the stone foundations of two farmhouses that had not been visible since the reservoir first filled, and local news coverage from that period shows fishermen and history enthusiasts walking ground that had been underwater for close to 40 years. None of the published photographs or accounts from that drawdown mention a bluff matching Sizemore's description, though it is worth noting that nobody looking at the exposed shoreline that year was searching for one, since the corridor's existence was not general public knowledge at the time, and would not become so until the Historical Society's later cataloguing work brought his notebook back into view. Whether that is because the drawdowns have simply never gone deep enough to expose that particular stretch of bluff, or because the original rockfall and decades of sediment have sealed the entrance behind material the flood itself never fully cleared, nobody currently studying the lake has been in a position to say, since no formal survey has ever been commissioned to look for it. The Kentucky Geological Survey's own modern staff, when asked in recent years about Sizemore's report, have confirmed that a version of it exists in their historical correspondence, but could not locate the original field maps that would allow anyone to pin the corridor's location with the precision a diving survey would require. The one document detailed enough to do that job is the pencil notebook in the Regional Historical Society's collection, and even that account, written by a tired man who never went back, describes a passage that stopped where his lantern gave out, not one that had reached its end. What the Nolin corridor leaves behind, then, is not a solved mystery and not an unsolved one in any dramatic sense, but something closer to an interrupted one, a passage cut by hands that history has a real, if incomplete, record for in one direction, and no record at all in the other, sealed twice over, first by a filing error and then by 60 feet of reservoir water, before anyone qualified to finish the question was ever given the chance to ask it properly. Somewhere beneath Nolin Lake, if the sediment has not filled it and the rockfall has not crushed it flat, a 100-year-old survey report and a 2,000-year-old mining gallery both wait on the same unfinished sentence, one that a farmer's lantern light interrupted for exactly one afternoon in 1937, before the water came back and took the question with it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.